This is the world's first clock made out of a silicon wafer, and today I'm going to show you how to make it. So, for those of you who don't know what a silicon wafer is, it's essentially a 1mm thin piece of silicon, or you can actually think of it as a piece of glass. This material is very fragile and can shatter easily when in its wafer form. A silicon wafer has hundreds of dies on it, and you can actually see the individual dies here. Each square or die you see will be put into a plastic housing called a package, and then those packages are put on circuit boards, and a lot of people just know them as motherboards. And those are used for a variety of different tasks. Now that we understand the basics of what a silicon wafer is, let's talk about how I'm going to cut this out. So like I mentioned, this is a very fragile piece of material, so using a drill to cut out the hole in the center, or using an X-Acto knife or something like that to cut out the numbers around the outside totally wouldn't work. So we had to come up with a solution, and that solution was to use a high-powered laser. This is Nathan, and he's a good friend of mine that offered to let me use his high-powered laser to cut out the numbers and the center hole for the shaft to feed through. But before we get to the cool laser cutting, I needed to figure out a way to cut these numbers around the outside of the wafer evenly and symmetrically. So what we ended up doing was we 3D printed a guide that would sit in the middle of the wafer so we would know exactly where to laser out each number. Without this step, it would be very difficult to get the numbers to be evenly spaced. And once we had that, we went out to the garage and started working on the wafer. We aligned the wafer and the guide such that we could see the projection of where the laser would be cutting, and we cut out the first letter, C. I thought it would be a cool idea to cut out the time digits out in hex, and if you're unfamiliar with what hex is, it's basically just a different way of keeping track or counting numbers that engineers use, versus the traditional decimal way that most people think about, which counts 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Hex is different because it counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F, but obviously there's not that many numbers on the clock. So, you may also have noticed that we had a fan that was sucking out all the particles that got blasted off the wafer. And this serves two purposes. The first being, we didn't want to inhale any of the wafer dust or debris that was getting blasted off from the laser. And the second is, it can also damage the lens. So we had to be careful on how fast we were lasering the wafer. Like I said, this thing is very fragile. So as you can see, we're taking breaks in between each laser pass due to the thermal shock that could potentially shatter the wafer. I could actually hear the cracking noise on the wafer due to the thermal shock, so that's why we gave it about 30 seconds in between each pass. Okay, so the next number is 4. So we had a big plastic piece holding up the wafer so that when we cut the number out, it would fall right through. But as you can see, we're lasering directly into the plastic right now. So thankfully, all the gunk from the plastic that got melted wiped right off the wafer, which was better than what happened the first time. Initially, when we tried this, we had 2 aluminum blocks holding up the wafer, and as we were lasering the numbers out, we noticed that the wafer got welded to the aluminum blocks, and we tried to get them off, but had little success, and the wafer shattered on us. Something else you might have already noticed is some of these numbers have centerpieces like 6 and 4 and 8 and A and B. All of these numbers are going to have their centerpieces fall out. So what we ended up doing was we made sure to collect all of these pieces, and after we finished cutting out the wafer, we put tape on the backside of the wafer, used tweezers to carefully place those bits where they needed to go, and then we used some epoxy to further hold them into place. So the next step was to make the wooden enclosure. I bought a piece of oak plank, and I cut slices into it with a table saw, and this was to make sure the plank wouldn't snap when I wrapped it around the wood. Then I used some epoxy and a ratchet strap to hold it all together, and when I checked it in the morning, thankfully it didn't spring open. We didn't know if it was going to spring open or not, but thankfully it didn't. And then, yeah, that was pretty much it. I epoxied the motor into place, 3D printed a ring to hold the LED strip, and stained the wood. Then I put the wafer on and it was good to go. So that was it. It was a finished project. I had a lot of fun working on this, and to show that this is actually functional, here's a time lapse of the clock over about 8 hours or so. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.